And now the game was over. Both sides decimated by exhaustion, scattered over the board in unfathomable entropy. Dawn broke over the Northumbrian landscape, whereupon the castle of Hogwarts stood proud. But, which side has won? What are the losses? What is the verdict? The observer has a deal of a job now to work out exactly what is now going on, for there are many wizards walking around, talking to one another, pointing, writing and scurrying off. These are the victors of this battle who are now undertaking the tedious task of accountancy. But be under no illusion, the triumph has not been without sacrifice. Those heralding a glorious victory are in addition, nursing the wounds of loss. And as one wizard approached another, pointing to a piece of parchment that another had given him, a third silenced them all by pointing ahead to one of their number stumbling into view, holding in his arms a body. 88,888,888. Sirius Black staggered through the tunnel that led from the Shrieking Shack with Cecilia Frobisher in his arms, down from the hillock where the Humping Willow stood, before making his way determinedly towards the plain of battle. The first to notice him walking towards them was Bertie Griffin, who pointed his presence out to Arthur Weasley, both of whom withdrew their wands. Too many Death Eaters had escaped that night to risk the unchallenged approach of a mysterious figure through the early morning misty rain. "Sirius!" declared Arthur, when they recognized him, and he looked in horror at Cecilia's ashen-skinned features. "What happened?" "I have to get her to Poppy," he said quickly, striding past them. "There's a chance that she may still alive." In his wake came other wizards of the Order, following Sirius up through the gates and into the courtyard of the deserted castle. The students and staff had been evacuated home by Aras from the Ministry the night before, and Sirius clung tighter to Cecilia's body, ignoring the many calls for explanation by more wizards as he strode purposefully through the main doors of the school and up the wide staircase. They had gained quite a following by the time Sirius had reached the hospital wing. The sight of one of the Order's more controversial members carrying the lifeless body of the mole member he once attempted to kill was of far more interest than wondering which of the 5 sightings of Voldemort they should follow up. And more of a scene unfolded as Sirius marched towards Madame Pomfrey, who, after indicating where he could place Cecilia's body, declared that she was beyond her help. "But she is alive." Sirius rounded the bed at the far end of the hospital upon which he had laid Cecilia gently. "You have to do something, Poppy." The crowd of Order members had grown now, taking in Moody, Kingsley Shacklebolt and Professor McGonagall. "Take her to St. Mungo's. Probably too fragile to move." "There's nothing I can do with a mole," reaffirmed Poppy, who looked distinctly harassed by the invasion of her hospital. She looked over at Cecilia again, took in her ghastly features and filthy appearance, her blood-spattered face, ragged clothes and torn skin, shaking her head in emphasis. Around them the wizards murmured amongst themselves as she looked her over critically. "Does Dumbledore know about this?" Arthur Weasley, looking around the wizards, almost a dozen in total. "He's at the Ministry," began Bertie, glancing at Kingsley. "I can flew him," replied Kingsley Shacklebolt. "He'll need to know that she's dash." "That she's what?" Sirius turned on Shacklebolt quickly. "Dead? Because she's not." He trailed off as he felt Poppy's hand on his arm. "Tell me in detail, Sirius. How did she gain these injuries?" Sirius turned from the crowd and looked at Poppy, agitatedly, and the nurse waited for a response. "What?" he said, confused. "You say she's still alive. It would be useful to know. And," she turned at the ever-growing congregation, "it would be useful if you were to leave me to it. Madame Pomfrey, we could." Alastor Moody shuffled closer to Cecilia, scrutinizing her with his mad eye before looking at the healer. "But seeing as we all saw her face Voldemort, in the guise of Snape, I should add dash. Which means she must have taken Polyjuice Potion," another wizard at the back chipped in. Alastor shot the interrupter a look before looking back at the nurse. "And before that, "The Cruciatus curse," said someone else. "She didn't look well the last time I saw her, neither. She disguised herself as Snape and faced Voldemort." Sirius looked at Madame Pomfrey and then back to Cecilia urgently. "A potion. And dash. Probably stress from teaching those children of ours. Bloody stupid to ask someone like her to take on a class full of them with everything else she had to do." Okay, stop." Poppy Pomfrey held up her hands in desperation and she straightened her cap and smoothed her apron in an attempt to convey a more professional air. "Will one of you just give me the facts? Please." She turned to Sirius. "You brought her here, Sirius. I understand that she took Polyjuice Potion and faced the Voldemort. And that she was tortured. Anything else?" The hospital wing went quiet as the wizards listened raptly to Sirius Black tell the tale of the last 8 hours in Cecilia Frobisher's company. "And that's when I brought her here, Poppy," he concluded, noting the look of paling horror on the witch's face. Then Sirius looked back at Cecilia as Poppy began to shake her head. I have to admit, I don't know how to treat her." Poppy cast her gaze upon Cecilia again as stronger early morning rays beamed in through the stained glass of the hospital wing. "My only hope will be to make her comfortable once I've examined her. Now, if you'll all excuse me dash." "Make her comfortable?" Sirius snapped back furiously. But Arthur Weasley put a hand on his shoulder and he stopped his would-be advance, looking round at him. Madame Pomfrey nodded firmly. "All we can do it wait dash." Like the last time. All eyes turned to the wizard who had spoken behind them and the wizards parted like a shoal of fish as he hobbled towards them. Even severely injured Severus Snape looked formidable and he advanced on Sirius hotly. "What did you do this time, Black? How is it that you brought her here like that and that she is now lying there?" He made to move his arm in her direction but Sturgis Podmore stepped in front of Snape as he wobbled back and forth before seizing the bed frame and gripping on tightly. As he did so, his gaze lingered on Cecilia for perhaps a second longer than was necessary to assess her injuries. "Don't be hasty, Severus," Podmore began. But Sirius had turned and began to bear down on him. "These injuries, Snape, were caused by her taking a potion. Do you know what she tried to do?" Mutely, Snape shook his head. "I'll enlighten you. She took Polyjuice Potion and became you and then once you'd scarpered last night and she faced Voldemort on her own." Sirius broke off as he looked with relish on Snape's confused features but before he could continue, Madame Pomfrey interrupted. "Enough. There has been enough. Severus," she turned to look at Snape, who was still holding the end of the bed frame. "Return to your bed, you are still far from well. Gentlemen, and ladies," she nodded towards the watching crowd, acknowledging Minerva McGonagall Elspeth Banks who was straining to see at the back. "I need to examine my patient, for you believe Sirius," she turned to face him, "that I can still save her life. Now," she surveyed the wizards as one, "if I am to do that I need to examine her alone." Folding her arms to underline her insistence, she glared at the audience who began to back in towards the door, Sturgis Podmore holding out his arm to assist Snape back to his bed around the corner of the hospital wing until finally all had left the nurse with her patient. "Well, nearly all. You too, Sirius," Poppy added, looking along his line of sight to where he was staring. "You did the right thing. You brought her here." "Poppy, what can I do? What could I have done? She refused to tell me anything." Madame Pomfrey held up a hand and shook her head sadly. "I will tell you this now, Sirius, if she has suffered the Cruciatus curse then she will more than likely have severe internal injuries. Which will mean it is unlikely she will awaken." Sirius looked at her aghast. "But she recovered before." His voice trailed off as the nurse nodded slowly. "I know, and she was lucky to have done so. But I'm afraid," she continued, looking sadly at Cecilia's immobile form, "you would have been too late in any case. She took Polyjuice Potion at her own free will. She knew what she was doing. Even without the spell injuries, I don't think there's much you could have done that would have made a difference. 88,888,888. 4 days after the Great Battle, as it was being dubbed, the still deserted castle was playing host to the Order of the Phoenix while they continued in their work, in collaboration with the Ministry of Magic, with the specific objective of capturing Voldemort and the rest of the Death Eaters. Inside its cold walls, or, more specifically, the common rooms, the members of the Order who had elected to remain buzzed to and fro between the grounds of the castle and the Great Hall, where temporary desks had replaced the long house benches, and, when evenings came, to the Gryffindor common room. Underneath an invisibility cloak which, it has to be said, has seen a lot of action since it has come into Harry's possession as a first year, 3 student wizards huddled close together. One of them pressed his ear against the door in order to catch as much of the meeting that was being held by the remnants of the Order of the Phoenix. Hermione shifted further forward, trying not to stand on Ron's foot, and handed Harry what looked like some flesh-colored string, nudging him to gain his attention as he craned his head towards the door. "Thanks," he whispered, before placing one end into left ear and trained it on the conversation in the Great Hall again before handing 2 other extensions to Ron and Hermione. Inside, Dumbledore was chairing the meeting, the first since the battle, and, having informed the Order of the role of the Ministry in the hunt for Voldemort, was now allowing for others to speak, adding to the information already supplied. Around him sat wizards in various stages of health. Sturgis Podmore was nursing a swollen ankle and sported a large bandage round his head. Kingsley Shacklebolt looked on, quill shaking whilst taking minutes. A spell had damaged his nerves and he was having trouble controlling the quill as it looped the information which had been discussed jerkily onto the parchment. Adjacent sat Mr. Weasley, his leg covered in a bandage and his left arm in a sling, and was looking every so often over Kingsley's shoulder. "Now that we have discussed the Ministry's role, may I be the first to congratulate us all on our outstanding achievement last week as I open our first meeting outside Grimmauld Place." Dumbledore surveyed the wizards, who were grouped around on chairs near the center of the Great Hall, looking at each one in turn and nodding before continuing. Many of the Order looked at one another, confused. 1 or 2 began to clap, applause which broke off almost as soon as it had begun. "Apologies, Kingsley, for our Firestone, who is recovering in St. Mungo's from a rebounding stun performed at point-blank range, to Remus Lupin, who is otherwise engaged on Order business, and Severus Snape, who is still recovering in the hospital wing." The wizards amongst them exchanged glances before looking back at Dumbledore, waiting anxiously. They had not been expecting a meeting yet, for there had been no clear leads and nothing, as far as they were able to ascertain, had brought them any closer. As it stood, the information had been patchy and some did not fit or make sense. "I expect you are all wondering why I have organized this meeting this afternoon when I realize we have nothing solid as yet to work on." Mrs. Weasley nudged her husband swiftly in the side and 1 or 2 others opened their eyes in surprise. Even Minerva McGonagall looked slightly taken aback. "My objectives are clear. I wish us to clear up misunderstandings that may be clouding our work with the hoped-for outcome that Lord Voldemort will be captured in his weakened state and brought to justice." Stroking his beard into a point, he glanced at Minerva McGonagall and nodded, and she got to her feet and approached Dumbledore, standing next to him as the wizard sat down on a large wooden chair that stood before them. Professor McGonagall sounded a little nervous when she began to speak. This was the first time that the 3 students eavesdropping the conversation had ever heard a tremor in her voice, and behind the thick wooden doors Hermione shuddered. "The battle was long and that is to say us, we suffered at the hands of our enemy. In the end victory was ours, and with the help of furtherers from the Ministry we were able to capture and send for imprisonment 18 Death Eaters. 7 were killed in the course of the night and the remaining 5 are still at large." She glanced at the scratching quill that Kingsley Shacklebolt was guiding carefully. "Yes, Molly? Dumbledore looked at Mrs. Weasley's raised hand, raising his eyebrows and nodding, and Molly glanced around nervously. That's the same number as we lost, isn't it? Around her there were shuffles and whispers, and nods of confirmation. Indeed. We lost 7 of our number. Dumbledore looked deliberately at each member as he spoke. 7 good wizards whose lives we will give meaning to with our new mission. Betty Griffin got to his feet unsteadily, his high-pitched voice ringing out around the great hall. At his hearty declaration the people around him began to murmur their agreement, nodding and whispering. Many were shocked to see Minerva so visibly unnerved, and she looked across to Dumbledore. The great wizard returned her look and nodded slightly before rising to his feet. As he did so, Minerva sat hastily back down. The spell acted as it did for Harry when he faced Voldemort as a baby. In conjunction with the potion, the effect was a replica of Lily Potter's motherly love for her son at the time when he needed her most of all. Voldemort was very much damaged by the spell, more so than 16 years ago, but he is not gone. Under the invisibility cloak, Ron nudged Harry. But he needn't have. Harry was only too clear about what he had just learned. In his heart of hearts he knew that he would know when Voldemort was gone, and that little part of him that he shared with the terrible wizard was very much alive. I'll be frank, fellow wizards, if Cecilia had not put her life on the line, his severe debilitation would not have come about. Voldemort escaped. However, he was incapacitated by the potion she made. I believe her actions were a result of our demands that the potion be rushed to meet our time scale. Sturgis Podmore raised a hand and Dumbledore nodded in his direction, and the wizard smiled round the group. Is there any news of her, Dumbledore? Minerva? Of Cecilia Frobisher? He looked between them questioningly. Minerva rose to her feet again slowly. I took the liberty of speaking to Poppy Pomfrey before tonight's meeting. Cecilia Frobisher has been unconscious for 5 days with no sign of any improvement. In her professional opinion, Madame Pomfrey believes that we might have to admit she will never come to. We need to inform her family. Sirius got to his feet and loudly addressed the order, but Sturgis glanced at him before looking again at Minerva McGonagall. Can she be specific about Cecilia's injuries, Minerva? The witch nodded her head. The potions she took, the polyjuice, which had been modified to extend its efficacy. Hermione gasped sharply, making Ron jump. He looked at her quickly before rubbing her arm soothingly. And the Veritaserum that we witnessed Lucius Malfoy force upon her, in the appearance of Severus. Both have had adverse effects upon her health, causing the unconscious state in which she is now. However, it was the internal injuries that she suffered physically at the hands of the Voldemort which has exacerbated the damage to her body tissue. But she survived last time, said Bathsheba in a slow, high-pitched voice, and some eyes fell uncertainly on Sirius. Isn't she likely to survive this time? Minerva shook her head as a low undercurrent of noise began. She waited until it had died down. Poppy believes the polyjuice potion acted as a slow-releasing toxin, destroying her internal organs, and in addition, the torture at the hands of the Death Eaters. She glanced quickly at Sirius, who was now holding his head in his hands. Was this fate likely to have happened to Harry? He took the potion, after all. Kingsley Shacklebolt raised his hand to indicate that he was now contributing. Harry held his breath. He felt fine now, and even then, after taking it. The battle had been ferocious, much worse than he had imagined, and he had even fought a few Death Eaters before being elbowed out of the way and to the back of the advancing order, finally being taken to the hospital by Minerva McGonagall, spending the night there under the relentless care from Madame Pomfrey, being asked questions and poked and prodded before being unceremoniously released in the morning when his bed was required for the vast array of injuries being sported by many of the order. It would seem that by Cecilia's act of self-sacrifice was designed to prevent Harry from taking it. He has succumbed to few ill effects, however his aim is somewhat off and spells he has subsequently tried to perform have been affected adversely. Outside Harry nodded in confirmation at Hermione and Ron, who were staring at him demandingly. Indeed, it seemed that any spells he cast had now taken on a life of their own, the most interesting of which had been a refracted Accio charm which had resulted in Percy Weasley flying over the banister of a first-floor staircase, almost landing on top of him and chaotically unfilling the orders, citing reports that he, Percy, had spent 3 hours previously filing and cross-referencing, but this had improved dramatically as the week wore on. However, it would seem at present that there is no reason why these effects should be permanent. Minerva folded her arms to indicate that was all Say was prepared to say on the subject and sat down hastily. Then can we suppose that if she had had time to complete the potion using Lily's DNA to its fullest effects, the potion would have been perfect? This time Sirius got to his feet and turned to Kingsley, his expression less forthright than it had been earlier that evening. All the Order were looking at him now, including McGonagall and Dumbledore. He had barely spoken to anyone on the subject of Cecilia Frobisher since he had brought her to the hospital wing early that Sunday morning, ignoring calls for information and issuing rude rebukes when challenged. Whatever he had to say, everyone was sure it would be significant. Time was not what she needed. It would seem she didn't take the sample from Godric's Hollow. Cecilia informed me of this before she did. 1 or 2 of the wizards staring avidly at him widened their eyes in anticipation, before she became unconscious. Therefore she chose to carry on without it, thus acceding to our request. For a few moments, both within the Great Hall and without, silence took on a new meaning. Not only were particles of matter around them immobile, they began to shrink in a kind of anti-silence in response to the bombshell, as if to anticipate and accommodate the unavoidable shift in understanding. "She planned it!" exclaimed Mrs. Weasley in horror, breaking the silence loudly. "She intended to give up her life. We must have treated her so badly she thought there was no other way." She turned to her husband, raising her hand to her mouth, and Arthur hugged her close in comfort as around them the rest of the Order began to speak. "No, Molly. She did not think that. Not all of us treated her badly." "I should have told someone," whispered Hermione urgently to Ron, as Harry continued to stare at the wall in fixed concentration on the conversation they were hearing. "When she told me how she was feeling, I could have helped. I could have told someone about the notebooks and they would have read them and known." Molly looked up to Arthur, tears in her eyes, and added, "And now she won't ever know how brave we think she was." "Yes, that is certainly true. A tragic end for them all. Just like Theoda the Ferocious in the Middle Ages." Hermione looked at Ron, giving him the same horrified look that Mrs. Weasley was giving Mr. Weasley. "They're talking like she's dead," she whispered, her voice choking up, and Ron took her hand. "She's not," he began reassuringly, but Hermione opened her eyes wider in astonishment. "How can you say that? You've seen her. We all have. She looks like Cedric looked when Harry brought him back last year." "SHHH," Ron instructed urgently, nodding towards Harry as he turned from his concentrated eavesdropping. "Well, you were the one who said it," said Hermione accusingly, but her tone was cut with emotion, and this time Harry touched her shoulder comfortingly before jumping to alertness again as they heard Dumbledore's voice. "Alas, it would appear so. She fought exceedingly well and with fierce bravery. As did we all here. The results speak for themselves." He surveyed the members slowly, who were now back in their seats listening to the head of their Order address them with fond solemnity. "Nearly all of the Death Eaters are behind bars at Azkaban, many sporting injuries better than your own. Indeed, Remus Lupin took a great big bite out of Lucius's leg." "Bravo!" shouted someone from the back of the group. "And I do not believe that Barnaby Wellington will be able to participate in the many sporting events which require the use of his wand arm." At this there was a round of applause, some were on their feet and cheering. "May I ask, Dumbledore, where is Remus this evening?" The question came from Dumbledore's left, from an elderly Order member who had initially opposed Cecilia's joining of the Order. "Ah, Agnatia," replied Dumbledore, casting a serene look on the owner of the Opustherian Diagonae, "Miss Bouts." "Indeed, indeed." He took his gaze over the whole Order again as hush descended. Agnatia Bouts had reminded them of Remus Lupin's absence, and it was beginning to unnerve a few of them. This brings me to the most vital piece of information, that information I need to share with you all, which makes pertinent the information that Cecilia Frobisher managed to acquire and share with us before Christmas, both regarding the potion and the history thus associated. He glanced around the group again. One or two were exchanging worried glances. "I have the permission of Remus Lupin to share his role in the business with the Order. I ask you to excuse my repetition if you are already aware of some of this information, but I wish you to all be fully aware of this, which I should, in truth, have shared with you 6 months ago. It is time, witches and wizards, to allow it to be exposed in the open. It must be a secret no longer." For a good few minutes the silence was deafening. The wizards, as a man, said nothing but shuffled on the assembled bench, looking at Dumbledore and waiting for him to speak. The Reciprocator movement, as founded by pure-blood wizards in the 18th century, has survived, illegally, for the past 200 years. Raymond Lully, whose work was so prominent during the 20th century and was murdered at the Goblin riots in 1956, was almost the last of the movement to collaborate with moles in projects for our mutual benefit. His mistake, which led to the involvement of Voldemort, was to recruit Oswald Avery, who, as we know, one of his first followers, also a Death Eater whose son Voldemort murdered before the battle. There was mutters amongst the Order. Avery's notoriety as the cause of the Goblin riots was huge, and it was well known that Avery Jr. had followed in his father's footsteps. Lully appointed him to the research of genetics in the 1930s. However, his trust was betrayed, and when he realized this, he hid the work of all the Reciprocators with his best friend. Dumbledore saw a hand raised, and he nodded to Charlie Weasley, who appeared to be shaking, his dragon-tooth earring oscillating slightly as he looked at Dumbledore. "So his work was lost?" Charlie raised his hand automatically. "All of the Reciprocators' work?" Dumbledore shook his head. "Lost? Not at all, Charlie. We all know of mysterious mythology. Indeed, there is scarcely a wizard household that had that as a staple storybook, nor a wizard who has been entertained by its tales. However, a copy that contained the most recent and pertinent work was that entrusted to John Lupin, a few weeks before Lully died." There was a mumble which grew rapidly from the Order. Dumbledore raised his hands for quiet. "His son, Remus Lupin, has consented for me to share this information with us, not least due to his incapacity for his condition." As he spoke, Dumbledore withdrew his wand, allowing a stream of silvery light to emanate from its tip. Like Sirius's memory which he had showed Cecilia in the darkness of the Shrieking Shack, this wisp formed itself into the shape of a screen, larger than that of Sirius's, and the wizards turned to face it, knowing that a memory would shortly be replayed for them from Dumbledore's mind. Without warning, Remus's face flickered into view. He appeared to be sitting in Grimmauld Place, at the kitchen table again, his face tired and worn. Dumbledore said nothing and allowed the Order to view the memory. "I remember when I became a werewolf," said Remus, speaking to Dumbledore as if he was speaking to a video camera. "And now I will tell you all now about Raymond Lully, and how my family is involved." He swallowed carefully, and the pause in his monologue prompted many of the Order to wonder whether he was swallowing down deep-seated emotion. "I was 8 and my father had just finished reading to me Imelda. I fell asleep with the book in my arms as I always did. Father had promised to keep it safe for Lully, but he indulged me, retrieving the book from my room later. One night he entered and Fenrir Greyback was in my room." Remus broke off, This time he definitely was holding on to emotion. The strain on his face to maintain composure was almost too much for some of the order to bear, and one or two wizards had turned away rather than watch. Greyback growled at me to hand over the book, but I refused. I was defending it for father. The clouds changed and transformed. Then he bit me, but still I would not release the book. Father came in and saw him off. Remus trailed off and looked to the floor, his unkempt hair visible to all, and for the fourth time that evening shocked silence reigned as Dumbledore redirected the fading silver stream of memory back towards his head. The children under the invisibility cloak looked at one another aghast. Though they had not seen Remus in the memory, they had heard what he had said, and the information Dumbledore had imparted before. Not knowing what to say to one another, they reinserted their extendable ears and continued to listen. "So, you are saying that the information contained specifically in Remus Lupin's father's copy of Mysterious Mythology contained the information needed by Cecilia to form the basis of the universal link? And you needed a scientist from the Mole world to sort out the important facts before we made the potion for Harry?" As one, the order turned to member on the second bench. Mouths fell open in awe. Dumbledore smiled serenely. "I always knew you were a very perceptive student, Tobias." He nodded towards the thin, pale-haired close to the back. "Your succinct summary is indeed the point I was looking to make, and exactly the reason that I wrote on your school-leaving report that any future employer would be barking mad not to employ you over any other applicant." The member Tobias blushed heavily, recalling Cornelius Fudge picking up on this at his interview for a position of ministerior. "However, I did not count on Mrs. Frobisher's emotional attachment to the lad, and to many of us." "Where is Remus now?" asked Molly Weasley, an air of panic in her voice. "With the child. On guard lest Greyback, one that we did not capture, discovers her whereabouts and decides to go after her again. Besides," he insisted. "How is the little girl?" pressed Molly. "She was placed with Cecilia's family following the death of her parents, wasn't she?" Dumbledore nodded slowly and looked from Mrs. Weasley back to the Order as a whole. "On the day before the battle, Lupin discovered that Greyback had discovered her. He found Freya Mitchell hiding in Mrs. Wells's house, under the bed, with a book. Under Bellatrix Lestrange's orders he was to retrieve, and so he broke into her bedroom. Heavens! The girl." Molly Weasley put her hand to her mouth in horror. "Is absolutely fine," Remus got there just in time, "and I believe Greyback will be a while recovering from the one that you, Bill." Dumbledore looked across at the eldest Weasley child, managed. Bill Weasley beamed with pride. His jelly legs ginks had allowed him to inflict a rather effective stun, which had sent Greyback into the forest where he was chased by a herd of Centaur. The house he burned to the ground, however. Mrs. Wells, Miss Amy Wells and Freya Mitchell have been visited by the befuddlers who modified their memories. They now believe that they have lived together for the last 9 years in the cottage near Inverness since the birth of the girl. They are now under ministry protection, and ours of course. They should be told of Cecilia, declared Mrs. Weasley firmly. They are the only family she has. At her words the Order began to mutter to one another, debating the situation. "Yes, Molly, they should. But it is far too dangerous at the moment, with Greyback and some Death Eaters still on the loose. And Voldemort, he is injured severely. However, he will seek revenge as soon as he can get it." "Then Lupin should be told of Cecilia," insisted Mrs. Weasley, this time imploring Minerva McGonagall. "If what you told me earlier is true, Sirius Heads looked sharply between Molly and Sirius, wondering exactly what Sirius had told her, but before Sirius had a chance to reply, the door to the Great Hall swung opened. Past the students, who had only just managed to get out of the way and had shuffled back from their vantage point, Snape hobbled determinedly. He looked dreadful, far more than usual. He must have had a chance to change since Fred and George had carried him to the hospital wing, but, other than that, he looked like they had found him, bruised and battered. hair bedraggled and ungroomed, sporting what looked like undesigner stubble on his face. In his hand was a walking stick, like a large version of a wand, and he leaned on it rhythmically as he made his way towards the assembled order. Behind him, just before the door closed of its own accord, Hermione, Harry, and Ron, still shrouded from view under the invisibility cloak, sneaked into the Great Hall. "Severus, we weren't expecting your presence to this meeting." Minerva smiled weakly towards her colleague, but before he could reply, Molly Weasley was on her feet. "Is there any news, Severus? Of Cecilia?" She stared at him desperately, waiting to sigh with relief, but he shook his head, ignoring the fact no one had asked how he was. "She is the same." He cast a look at Sirius. "Which is to say, her physical injuries have much exaggerated the effects of the potion. She is not likely to recover. It may have been a different matter had she been brought to Madame Pomfrey directly." Sirius was on his feet now, rising to Snape's inflammatory words, but then, to the surprise of all present, bowed his head looking embarrassed. "I didn't know," Sirius replied. "I thought it was just physical injuries." Snape curled a lip in loathing. "Interesting, Black. Considering the fact that every time you and she have been alone in each other's company you have been attempting to carry out her assassination. Convenient, wouldn't you say, if she died in your care ... of her injuries?" His lip curled further as he watched Sirius step towards him, feeling inside his robe for his wand, and Snape placed a hand on the table, holding himself up. "Gentlemen," began McGonagall, but Dumbledore put a hand on her arm. "To think we drove her to suicide, Severus," continued Molly Weasley, her distraught words reverberating loudly around the Great Hall. "That was what Sirius said. He remarked that at every opportunity when she could have gone home, she chose to remain with us." There were mutterings of agreement from the wizards that echoed Molly's distress. "And you should have completed this," declared Sirius, taking another step towards Snape. "Apparently you knew that she hadn't got what she needed from Godric's Hollow." All eyes were on Snape at this revelation, and both the Order and the eavesdroppers, who had pressed themselves against the furthest wall, watching events unfold, gaped at him. Snape fixed Sirius with a hateful stare. "It may have escaped your notice, Black, that unless Cecilia can complete her task in its entirety she will find another way of doing it." He narrowed his eyes as he looked at Sirius. "And her choice to sacrifice herself, Sirius, was entirely hers. I believe there's a lesson in that for both of us." The Great Hall imploded into silence. Time stopped still as the wizards, including Dumbledore, waited for the next move. Instead of flying at Snape, which many expected, Sirius stopped and lowered his withdrawn wand. "Yes," he agreed, looking at Snape. "I came to realize she was actually right. I was horrified when Harry informed me he had cursed her. I told him to watch out, but he ignored me. That was when we believed that she had Lily's sample." Snape shook his head slowly. "No. She didn't. You are right, I did know. And I allowed her to carry on, for I took the potion to check its safety for your godson." Harry nudged Ron in amazement. Surely it wasn't just him who had noticed the shift in the conversation. No longer were they sniping at one another, information from both wizards was being imparted without either laying the blame on the other. "I know," said Sirius. "I do not know how you managed to work with such a headstrong and determined woman as Cecilia Frobisher for the last 7 months, Snape. I mean, she was so resolute that she was not to be helped. She picked a fight with me to divert my attention from her condition, until it was too late." He continued to stare at Snape, and in turn, Snape returned his stare to Sirius. "But you kept her safe. In the Shrieking Shack. You thought to take her away from harm." As Snape spoke steadily, Sirius shook his head. Around them the Order continued to gape. "I thought to take you from harm. She was masquerading as you, if you recall." Snape nodded slowly. "She told me about your family," he continued. "Did she now?" And why would she do that? From their position Harry could see Snape's knuckle whiten over the end of his walking stick. Because of the less than admirable way I treated her when I believed she was you. And, I assume, because she believed she was going to die. Said Snape, holding Sirius's gaze. From what she said about your parents I can understand why you'd want mine, he conceded, continuing to look at Snape. Snape said nothing for a moment, before tipping his head in acknowledgement, his hair falling forward briefly. Any other last words? Prompted Snape, his voice even and steady. We spoke about Henrietta, continued Sirius, nodding his head slowly. I'll admit now before all here, I was actually wrong. I shouldn't have interfered. She would have been happier with you, rather than the fate she suffered because of me, Severus. The room stopped moving. It was unheard of for Sirius to call Snape by his first name. Also, thank you for taking the potion. If Harry hadn't been so headstrong, you could have saved him the trouble. Snape said nothing. He stood, still bandaged and stiff, at one side of the table. Then Sirius walked past Dumbledore and towards Snape, repocketing his wand and keeping his eye fixed on the wizard. And I apologize for my behavior about your father when we were at school. It was wrong of me to project my feelings of resentment about my family onto you. Now at least I know some of them turned out all right, that we have it in us to change. Mrs. Frobisher showed me that. Now this was the limit for most of the wizards there, who felt their mouths fall open and gasp aloud in undisguised shock and disbelief, including Hermione who, standing, covered her mouth quickly. Many turned to one another, unable to take in what came to pass next as Snape extended a hand in Sirius's direction. And no one was more surprised than Harry, holding onto Ron's shoulder for support when, before their very eyes, Sirius took it. 88,888,888. Harry retreated to the common room as the order began to file out of the meeting with Ron and Hermione, Ginny and the twins. The meeting had lasted a further hour, during which the wizards had discussed the most efficient methods of following up the enemy with the objective of recapturing them. The students were tired and they'd occupied their usual places on the sofas, Hermione and Ron on the smaller sofa, Harry next to Ginny, next to the twins on the other. The twins and Ginny were dying to hear of the details of what they had missed of the meeting, but the common room soon became populated with the wizards and witches who had been in the meeting. "We're off," said George as the wizards began to swarm in. "I don't think we can stand another night of reminiscences." "Yeah," said Fred, rolling his eyes. "There's only so much of Dad telling tales of their capers at school, and Mum shushing him and correcting him, making it sound like humorous misunderstandings." George nodded towards their father, who had begun a tale of nighttime wandering with Sturgis Podmore, their mother re-editing the more rule-breaking of pasts. "Where to?" hissed Ron as the twins headed towards the portrait hole. "Kitchens," they mouthed to him, and their brother nodded. Kitchens was code for them visiting Cecilia in the hospital wing. It took a long time for all six of them to get to the hospital wing from the common room. When they were sure they were free of adult presence, Fred, George and Ginny stopped walking when they heard parts of the story, imparted by all three at various intervals, requiring clarification for the more unbelievable parts. When they were finally at the doors of the hospital wing, Harry and the Weasleys pressed their backs against the adjacent wall as Hermione looked at them. "What?" she asked innocently, knowing what the answer would be. "Your turn, Granger," replied Fred, grinning. "This time tell her that Hagrid's rash has spread all over his body and she'll need double the Colomin that she did last night." "Has it?" asked Harry, out of interest. Fred and George had been inflicting chronic but harmless diseases on Hagrid in order to create a diversion so they could get in to see Cecilia. In all, The children had been allowed to see her legitimately for an hour since she was brought in, but in actual fact they had been in each evening, talking to her as well as amongst themselves, telling her information that was happening in the mole world that they were gleaning from the mole studies books, or reporting the progress of the Order on capturing the Death Eaters. "Yep," replied Fred mischievously. "That'll teach him to scoff all of our malady mixtures." "Ate a whole 2 pounds, added George, shaking his head. "It'll be a good couple of hours before she comes back." "At least, considering the side effects," remarked Fred, trying to stifle a smirk. Once Hermione had entered and, 5 minutes later, Madame Pomfrey had swept past them, clearly agitated. All 6 students crept across the floor of the general hospital room and through the second pair of double doors which led to the hospital wing's intensive care room. "Where did you 3 get to this evening when we were listening to the order meeting?" asked Harry, when they had all pulled chairs around Cecilia's bedside in the darkness. "Lumos," said Ron and Hermione, who then leaned over and placed their glowing wands, like lanterns, at the end of the bed. "We came here," said Ginny quietly. The twins nodded. "We asked about Cecilia, though wasn't too hard to pretend to care," added George, sadly. "She doesn't look any worse," said Harry, looking across her translucent features as Cecilia Frobisher lay motionless under the covers. At least Poppy had tended her, he thought. She was now in a nightgown and it looked as if the nurse had brushed her hair. The bruises on her face and arms were beginning to yellow, which meant that she was still alive. However, there appeared to be more of them each evening they visited, and, though Harry hadn't mentioned it to the others, spots of blood on the sheets. "But she doesn't look better," replied Fred, and they all looked at her, lying unconscious before them. "At least it's not our fault this time," commented George. He and Fred nodded at one another before looking back at Cecilia. "Malfoy's in here somewhere," said Hermione conversationally. "It's his own fault, the idiot," replied Ron, scornfully. "He nearly wet himself when he saw a real Death Eater meeting." He smiled between Harry and Hermione proudly. "I got him fair and square. He nearly died when he heard Mrs. Frobisher say he was highly intelligent, stamped his feet when she insulted his father. Almost wept. Almost wept when Precious Daddy attacked her with the Cruciatus curse. Even he couldn't stand that, the weed." "That's 'cause of us," said George, looking at Fred and nodding with satisfaction. "When we brought Snape back, when we thought he was Cecilia, we got Goyle and Crabbe good and proper dash." "He was planning to get her, the git," added Fred, nodding at George. "Gave you quite a shock when we realized it was actually the real Snape," said Fred, laughing at his brother. "I mean, when you told him he was the best teacher that had ever walked the halls of Hogwarts." He nudged George, who had begun to turn red. "Shut up," he hissed darkly. "And when you kissed him," Fred added, grinning at Hermione, Ron, and Harry. "I thought it was her," moaned George, mortified. "And it was you that told him he was the best teacher that had ever walked the halls." "Oh, blessed heart!" exclaimed Fred, clutching his brother's arm dramatically. "She's our sort of chap," added George, looking at Fred. "For Queen and Country," they broke off, looking past Ron and at their sister. Ginny was crying. "Ginny," said Hermione kindly, as she got to her feet and pointed at her chair. Ron moved into it and sat down as Hermione sat in his and put a comforting arm around Ginny's shoulder. "I was so horrible to her," she sniffed, pulling out a lilac handkerchief from her jeans pocket. "Those things I said." "Forget it," said Harry, quietly. "Sirius has managed to put the past behind him by the sounds of it. You should too." "But then if she doesn't wake up and she dies," moaned Ginny through irascible sobs. "Then I'll go to Azkaban for murder," said Hermione softly, patting her hand. "No," said Ron. His brothers and sister, and Harry watched him early as he took Hermione's hand in his. "You did what she asked. You did it for a friend, He looked across at Harry, who nodded on agreement. "You are a very loyal friend, Hermione." Then Ron got to his feet again and placed something next to Cecilia. "What's that?" asked Harry, confused. "Well," began Ron. "It looks as if Malfoy was earwigging on us when we made your potion, Harry, and he decided to do a bit of rearrangement of the Mole Studies classroom." Hermione looked at him in alarm. "You mean to say that Malfoy did that?" The place looked like a hurricane had been through it. "Your mum and dad have just spent the last 4 days sorting it out." Ron nodded in confirmation. "He stole this," he continued, gesturing towards magic and moles that he had just pulled out of his robe. "I think he twigged that she wasn't a squib and was going to tell Daddy-O." Grim looks passed over their faces at Ron's words. None of them would put it past Draco Malfoy. "What about the rest of her stuff?" asked Hermione. "Were your mum and dad able to rescue much?" Ron shook his head sadly. "All her books, her notebooks with the link in he chucked on the fire, the git, and the potions he tipped away, let all the animals out, basically had a right old time." The children nodded. They had seen the devastation for themselves 3 days ago when Mr. Weasley called in Ron, Harry and Hermione to take away the Mole Studies textbooks. It was from these books that they had been updating Cecilia with information from the Mole world. "Have you got it?" asked Ron of his sister. Ginny nodded and handed him the book. The cover had a burn mark on it, but the pages were neatly filling themselves with Mole news. "Anything new?" asked George, curiously. Ron shook his head, thumbing back a couple of pages before looking at the last one, as words were appearing letter by letter. "Go on, read it out," prompted Harry, looking over his best friend's shoulder. "Yesterday was quite interesting." So Ron read out the next couple of pages worth of news to Cecilia, while the others listened in silence. When he had finished, they added their own comments before Hermione filled the unconscious Cecilia in with the news that they had heard downstairs. "And Snape and Sirius shook hands," she finished, nodding slowly, looking at Cecilia before turning back to Ron. "I can't believe it's going to end like this," Hermione exclaimed, her emotions spilling out. This was a surprise to all present, for she had recounted the information earlier so calmly. "Why did she do this to herself? I trusted her when I made that polyjuice potion and she took it herself." Hermione got to her feet and gestured angrily in the direction of the Forbidden Forest as she spoke. "However, does she expect us to behave sensibly when she, our teacher, does that? I don't think she's a very good role model." She trailed off and Ron took her hand, pulling her back down into her lap. "I think she's brilliant," replied Ron, looking at her again. "I mean, putting herself in the way of danger rather than letting anyone else do it." He looked at Harry, who was on his feet looking at them all strangely. "I still can't believe she made it without Mum's sample. She chose to die rather than take a bit of Mum or risk the potion she had on me." The others nodded. "She was intelligent," said Fred, looking at his twin. "She told us not to follow her." George nodded at Fred. "If we hadn't it might have been too late." "It might be too late for her already," sniffed Ron, and it was his turn to receive a hug from Hermione. "Don't talk about her in the past tense," chided Hermione quietly. "We have to hope." And, she looked around her friends, pausing to gain their attention. "I've made a decision. When I've got my newts, I'm going back home and studying science." She nodded at them, her voice calm. She had clearly given it a lot of thought. "I've got to think of the other part of my life too. Like when you were helping Professor Snape when she disappeared, Harry, it all fits. I asked Mum to send me a science book, and I'm beginning it all. And," Hermione looked across at Cecilia, "if when she wakes up, I will ask her to teach me." The young witch fell silent, dropping her head. Around her, her friends exchanged looks of incredulity. Hermione, who had spent the last 5 years proving that she was as good as any other witch or wizard, now wanted to learn mole science. Was there really no end to her talents? "Right," said Fred, as the school bell tolled midnight. "Madame Pomfrey'll be back in a few minutes, we'd better get back." And so, with reluctance, but with promises of their return, the 6 young wizards left Cecilia in the hospital wing. 88,888,888. The summer's day heat radiated around her. Cecilia looked towards the face of the sun and smiled. Her journey was taking her down a long country lane, towards home. She felt happy, she would see her family again, and she defied anyone not to be happy with weather such as this. Just a bit further down the road before her lay a green field, with cows lazily grazing. Her house lay across the field, so she looked for the stile she knew was round the corner. As she looked, some gulls circled overhead, and she could hear their wings beating as they flew. No stile, she realized, and proceeded further down the lane, looking for another means of access. As she walked, a sudden chill bit the air. The hedge seemed to grow taller around her, and cirrocumulus clouds flicked across the sun.